Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to gather again this morning. We're really in the series of taking a look at each of our topics that we have selected for the update of the state water plan and kind of vetting, learning, hearing from the groups that have put together or focused on those topics and seeing what we have drafted, especially in kind of a summary form for the state water plan and having some open discussions about each of those topics and what we're moving forward with. We started that with three topics. Here was, I guess it was last month, and that seemed to go pretty well and really generated some great discussion. So I won't take too much time here in the introduction. Everybody can see who's on from the participants list in the webinar, and I will say that we are continue to, as we work through this and ultimately head to another outreach opportunity. I am trying to reach out to the state or some at least the folks through the Illinois DNR on how we might do that better. How do we best reach out to disadvantaged communities or those that may have had challenges being able to participate in some of our outreach efforts, particularly given that we're still in, COVID mode and not really doing a lot of face-to-face kind of outreach. So I just wanted to make the group aware that still trying to see what other, insights or guidance we can get in terms of doing the best job we can, and particularly from a social justice perspective on our outreach, and certainly invite any of you that have insights or comments or thoughts on how we can do that best to let Wes or I know, and we can share that with the group as we move forward. So with that said, I think we'll just jump right in. The three topics today, we're going to cover water sustainability, flood damage mitigation, and integrated water management. And so I'll turn it over to Wes to take us into the water sustainability topic. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lauren. So at this time, I'll ask Tara if you could go ahead and pull up the water sustainability section to share on screen, and we'll get started. So just for you all, a little background before we dive in. Water sustainability is really focusing on the water quantity and ensuring that we have enough water quantity. Tara, if you don't mind, just zoom in, see if we can kind of get a full width or a little bit easier to maybe read. I'm not sure if anybody else can read that on their screen. It just looks a little small on mine. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a zoom option that you can hit just to pull it in a little bit. So, yep, that looks a lot better. Thank you. So again, we start with the overview of the section, and please let me know if you have any questions. You can use chat or just speak up, interrupt me. That's completely fine. We're having a very open dialogue, open discussion here. So however you feel best to chime in and share your thoughts on this, please feel free to do so at any time. Again, I start this section kind of as a background to what water sustainability is, and it's primarily focusing on the available water as it pertains to water quantity throughout the state. That's not limited only to drinking water, but that's also to irrigation, to industrial use, power supply uses, and also recreation and navigation as far as it pertains to having adequate quantity of water available to utilize water or those sectors. So we kind of start off with that in the first paragraph. The second paragraph, we go back to the 2006 executive order that really kicked off the regional water supply planning program, which is kind of the foundation of this section, and what it was back in the old 1983 plan essentially developed this program as a result, or it was kind of the grassroots of where this program started. And it just took a while to get initiated. So again, we kind of look at some of the issues as we kind of scroll down into the next paragraphs. We talk about the assessment of supply and demand and the need to do that on a statewide level to ensure that everybody has adequate water. And then we kind of finish this section or this portion of the section talking about Joliet as a case study, kind of giving a real world example on how and why this is so important and the troubles they faced and how this program and the sharing of technical knowledge to the community has kind of helped them find a path forward. So, and then we dive into the issues to some extent. We talk about having reliable planning and long-term sustainability for drought vulnerability, and kind of providing or ensuring that communities have the adequate resources they need, and to really just focus on planning ahead and having an idea of what the future holds. And as we scroll down a little bit further, we talk a little bit more as we move into climate change and how that affects water sustainability. An example given is the higher evaporation losses and our lack of resources evaluating that. And then the last paragraph kind of summarizes the use of the regional planning initiatives and working with the local stakeholders and special interest groups to evaluate or use the locals to essentially evaluate their own recommendations. So it's more of a grassroots initiative of having the locals come up with their own recommendations to solve their problems. Then they can feed that up to the state level to determine if there's any state level issues that need to be determined. So then we'll move quickly into the recommendations section. And again, it's just a brief statement talking about the water supply program and the efforts of that, and talking about also how we'll be coordinating with integrated water management and the climate change recommendations as well. So really the bulk of what we've talked about really comes down into the recommendations table. I'll go ahead and move down to the recommendations table. And as we see, the first topic we really wanted to address or look at is social equity and prioritizing services to vulnerable and low-income communities, communities that may not be able to go out and hire a consultant to do a study, and essentially render them the highest priority when it comes to state services. So that may include doing bathymetric survey on their reservoir. Maybe it's providing some additional technical assistance in evaluating their long-term water supply or demand. Or it may be, as we move in the future and other recommendations, we talk about potentially providing capital improvement funding for water supply initiatives. So really this is our section's attempt to try and address some of the social inequity issues that have come to be of high priority in this plan. And that's why we listed up at the very top. So I'll kind of pause for a moment if anybody has any questions on that first issue listed.
Well, this is Lauren. I guess I'll start off. Just by noting that this first one has overlap with the integrated water management. We were asking the DNR to work with EPA in terms of prioritizing the state revolving fund issues, but I think we were focused primarily on, the capital improvement projects, the water supply improvement. I'm wondering if this one has more of a focus on the planning side.
I think it's both. So it does talk about services rendered and capital improvement projects.
I just note that this is one of those cross-cutting kind of topics, I guess, that ties in with integrated water management.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. And we're definitely going to want to, again, that kind of pulls back to our topic of discussion at the last State Water Plan Task Force, how we talked about we'd still list these, but we kind of coordinate. Um, as we scroll down, I have some highlighted where we, want to make sure we coordinate with other sections, and maybe I should just note that one should also be further coordinated with integrated water management. So I can kind of make a note to that, but I think we're still kind of developing how we want to make sure we show all these cross-cutting topics and issues. I did note that there was, or see in the chat, there's some echo that's occurring. I think that may be just how I have my audio presented. I'll try and mute in between so that any speakers don't come back as an echo. Maybe I can change my audio settings here, but I apologize for the echo.
Wes, this is Greg Good. The echo is really coming from Lauren. I haven't heard any echo from you. But just a couple of real quick things. We're not doing the, your recommendations have the short-term verbiage on the upper left. We're getting rid of that, correct?
Yeah, that was a comment I was going to make as I was talking through it, is that I did want to go ahead and pull that row out. I forgot to remove that. So yeah, we'll go ahead and delete that out. We won't be doing short or long-term identifications on these topics. Yeah, thank you, Greg.
And sorry for being picky here, but you're missing a word, B. Communities that meet this requirement will be implemented as top priority. Sorry.
Nope, no problem. Yep, we'll take care of that.
Wes, this is Tara. In terms of that particular item, I like how you're presenting it, because as the flood damage mitigation, we have the exact same issue. We're trying to address it similarly, the same, and we could write the exact same thing, but it would be related to flood damage. So I don't know if it's cross-cutting per se, but in the long term, we all need to think about how we present our recommendations to make them all somewhat similar. So when I talk about my section today, you guys will see that I've tried to bring this in, but this might be a good way to cover it all as one recommendation.
Tara, that's a good point. It's a question, if we have something that's very similar, especially how this recommendation's worded, you could easily drop this into various other sections, I assume. I guess that's kind of a consideration for others, and I guess a discussion point. Do we want to have word for word identical recommendations when we have potential recommendations that are so similar? I guess I could see there being a benefit to having it identical just for consistency. I don't know. I'll take feedback from the group on that.
Well, this is Lauren, and I'll try shutting off my speakers to see if that helps with the echo. But I guess as we talked about last time, I do think there's still value in having, this kind of like a recommendation in each section for those that just turn to, say they just wanted to go into the plan and look at water sustainability. It would show up there, as opposed to saying, well, let's put this recommendation only in integrated water management. Well, folks would never see that and how it relates to water sustainability if it's not in that chapter, so to speak. So we can talk about making some similar language, but I do want to make sure, I think, that each of the recommendations stay in each of the sections. Thank you.
Yeah, Lauren, I think we kind of all agreed with that the last time, and it's good to reiterate that. I thought that in the last meeting, we also talked about kind of having a cross-cutting table where we kind of show where some of these recommendations show up in multiple sections. And I guess that point, I'd say that may be beneficial to have almost identical wording in those recommendations when possible. Just to show that consistency, and I guess that it truly is a cross-cutting issue. And we can kind of leave this recommendation vague, as I say, prioritize services, and I don't specify what services, as it could also apply to the damage mitigation section or various other sections. I guess, is that a direction we want to take, that we want to have identical wording in a generic way, that a certain recommendation can be essentially copied and pasted into multiple sections?
This is Greg. Good. I like that idea, and on the converse, however, then it almost looks like somebody reading all of this would say, well, look, they cut and paste the social equity recommendation in each one, and you know what I'm saying? It seems like, well, they're supposed to address this, so they just cut and paste it in each one of the 13 issue papers. That's kind of the risk maybe that you run. I don't know. Just a thought.
This is Glenn. I'll add in here as well. Perhaps where the wording would be the same, it could also have a reference to the other sections that were sharing that language. So in other words, if somebody just turned to one of these, as Lauren was mentioning, and saw it and didn't realize it was somewhere else, that this would be a way for them to know that it is somewhere else also, and attract the attention to, go to this other section for, a collaborative response, because this is a cross-cutting issue, somehow to list or link where they may be the same within the report. That's just a thought.
I'm kind of wondering if we should kind of see how some of the language shakes out between the 13 issues, and see if the commonality is reasonable, or there needs to be at least some uniqueness between them. Maybe, appreciate trying to figure out how we want to deal with it now, but maybe, again, since these are kind of sharing sessions, stuff like that, towards the end, when we decide how things might fit together, then we can maybe readdress this and see what the advantage or disadvantages would be.
This is Walt Kelly. I kind of agree with Greg. If you look at all the recommendations here, they're fairly specific, except for this one, which does sort of seem to be very vague and kind of hard to determine whether or not you actually meet this recommendation.
Yeah, well, this is Wes. This is one of those that I struggled with defining how to make this measurable, to say whether or not we're accomplishing it, other than, implementing some kind of tracking system in how we determine, where services are rendered throughout the state, and kind of tracking it that way. But that is one area where I struggled, was kind of how do you show that this was actually completed?
Is this something that will, actually, I mean, maybe the endeavor would be completed, but maybe, there's always going to be room for determining, at-risk communities that are going to need, some more directed assistance, and maybe it's an annual assessment, and not considering it you have annual funding, but I guess Because you had just said it was completed and is it really completed? Sorry.
This particular recommendation, you've got it focused solely to OWR. I wonder, I know in the ones we'll get into in the integrated water management, it's OWR and EPA collaborating to essentially do very similar. And I wondered if if this could be, develop a means to prioritize services to low and vulnerable communities and low income communities for this recommendation that would then be implemented by the various agencies that have capital to offer.
Yeah, this is Rick. I like that idea. It also allows for a more, I guess, consistent evaluation and determination across various programs. So I think that's going to be part of the challenge to define what that means, who and which communities meet this vulnerable and low income definition, and if we're consistent about that among various programs, I think that puts us in a strong position.
Hi, this is
Rick, I think
I'm sorry, am I interrupting anybody? Okay, so it seems like if during the process and we can develop some kind of the quantifiable metrics and to kind of annually or periodically monitoring or assess the progress and also the definition, it might be kind of more obvious actions to show what we're doing on this topic. And there are also some other fields people has been trying to do the similar thing. So for example, like an insurance company or accounting, like ESG accounting. So if we need to borrow some model, I'm sure there will be some available model for us to borrow and then to fit our need to evaluate this. Thank you.
Lauren, I am reminded of the annual metrics we have to put together on population served for each of our programs for OWR. I wonder if we would have something similar in identifying, vulnerable communities that we would do. And maybe that's what this recommendation becomes, is developing that metrics on how each agency evaluates and reports on their funding / services rendered to, at need community.
Yeah, and I think there are some criteria out there in terms of, a certain percentage of the population being below, this income level, or so it might just be a recommendation that we adopt a uniform standard for that, for determining vulnerable and low income communities or disadvantaged communities, or
Yeah, I kind of see that as a minimum of what we need to do is, all agree on what standard we're going to utilize to identify those communities. But then once we have those communities identified, are we going to track or somehow develop a plan or something to move forward on how we will serve those communities more or give a priority to those communities?
This is Mike. I think at this point, we make the recommendation as broad as we have here. I do kind of like it, with the exception of just the focus of OWR, that we could potentially just use it as a catch-all, because EJ is a ever evolving definition, and I don't think if we try to hone in on it very very finite, that we will always be hitting the mark moving forward.
I'd like to add to that as well. I think, it almost deserves a, maybe as outside of recommendations, is that it really could, depending on where you're looking at the issue, is that it's something that may or may not be an impact a certain area. And it's, might be in that section, you could kind of describe that, because it's like, when you're trying to come from a recommendation, it's, sometimes you don't want to be too broad, because it's like, how, you don't really have any kind of metrics to see how you're accomplishing that, and maybe better served in a separate section to kind of be able to put some brackets on it. Because if everybody's going to have this issue on there, but it's, similar cause, but it's, what is the strategy? Are we going to have a consistent strategy amongst all the different topics?
I think one of the comments I was going to make too was, I think it would be helpful to have a more clear definition. So when we say water sustainability, what we're actually referring to when we're talking about sustainability, because I do think that most people probably have a general understanding that we're talking about the actual source water itself. But just hearing everyone talk about specifically the social equity issue, and just quickly doing a little bit of research on that, almost everything that I see in more of the drought-stricken states where you're talking about equitable sustainability, it's more talking about water access, and specifically when it comes to potable drinking water. And so I think, as far as defining all of these other issues and providing and commenting on the recommendations, I think it'll be helpful to have a much clearer definition of whenever we're talking about each topic. So specifically defining what water sustainability is in terms of how we're addressing it within this report.
Tara, would you mind scrolling back the top? I just want to see if what we have listed at the top kind of meets what Brian is asking about here. If you don't mind, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. And it's a good point. I think we do need to clearly define what each of these topics are. I think it's almost the very first paragraph. I'm trying to recall exactly how it's worded. Having access to an adequate and reliable quantity of water. Brian, I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for a good enough definition, but I think that was kind of the intent of this opening paragraph here. Is that kind of meeting what you're asking, or you think we need to clarify it even in more detail?
Yeah, I think that could be good, but then I don't necessarily think that everything else corresponds with that, though, because if we're talking about access to it, to me, that's also an infrastructure type of an issue, and not just a source water issue, which it seems like all the comments are more geared to the source water and towards water usage, and not necessarily based on infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it can include infrastructure. I know that's kind of drawing the lines between, water loss and if that's an EPA thing or a DNR thing. But I think it would include infrastructure that's publicly owned.
Hi, this is Yifeng, and I just want to kind of remind our team here is when we talk about assessment, when we talk about quantified metrics, we no longer just talk about paper assessment. This is item 1, 2, 3. We check mark it. We give a rank of that anymore. I mean, think about right now, we have a tool and we have machine learning, we have AI, we can pull out the real-time data on many, many different sources. And we step into this era and we can really tap on those experts to help us make the assessment and metrics more dynamic and more diverse on the data source. So just a reminder to everybody, it's not just a paper assessment on two-dimensional metrics. Thank you.
So just kind of wanting to wrap up this first issue, this is typically how it goes as we get into one issue and you almost spend the full allotted time on this one issue. Definitely going to pull out OWR and replace it maybe with state agencies. And it's still kind of a question in my mind whether or not we're developing a means to prioritize, if we're kind of developing that, how are we going to do it, or are we just saying we're going to do it? And so do we want to come up with a plan to track how we do it, or are we just saying we're going to do it and kind of leave the verbiage as it is? I don't know if I've gotten kind of a clear indication if it's one or the
I think we're developing a means to how to do it in order to do it. I mean, I think the one has to come before the other. So develop the consistent means of prioritizing services to the vulnerable and low income communities in order to implement those services. I guess I would also add too, as we wrap this up, that to me, I think perhaps the intro or as part of the introduction we have to the state water plan would probably need to talk about social equity in general and just note how it does touch on all the topics included in some way, shape, or form. We can kind of address the fact that it's there in different forms in that introduction as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Lauren, what I'll do is maybe I'll try and rewrite this. I know that we'll have future meetings where we'll have individual topics, and maybe we'll see if we can kind of all come up with a verbiage that we agree on, and then whoever wants to place that in their recommendation section that's consistent and showing that we're all kind of in agreement on how the state of Illinois is going to do this moving forward. I think that's kind of the benefit, although it does look a bit copy and pasted, as some say. I think there can also be saying something that, the state of Illinois is in agreement and this is how we're going to move forward. Well, I agree. We'll develop the means, which includes, how we're going to define which communities fit in this category. And then how are we going to prioritize that? And then how are we going to track and report it is all kind of part of this recommendation I see. So I'll work on revising this language and maybe sending it out to some groups. Maybe if you're interested in having this recommendation in your section, just throw your name in the chat or something, and I can maybe coordinate with those specific individuals as we come with to the language that we all agree on. Does that sound good with everyone?
This is Gary Bingenheimer with EPA State Revolving Loan Fund Programs. Could you scroll down to number 9? Yeah, I think that item can be stricken from this document. Back in 2017, we did, in fact, modify our state administrative rules for the drinking water loan program. We can now fund planning activities. And then as far as other eligibility requirements, we can only go up to what the federal regulations require. So I don't think any legislative action would be necessary. We've pretty much expanded what we can fund here in our state programs to match what can be done within the federal umbrella. So I think we've taken care of this item actually.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'll take that off and mark it as completed.
Great.
Any other comments to recommendation number 1 before we move on? And again, if you want help with providing some input on this, again, either send me an email, put your name in chat or something, so that we can kind of all come to agreement on how this is best worded. With that, we will move on to number 2. Number 2 is sustainable water supply. And this is updating a statewide assessment of water demand forecast on an annual basis based on water use data. And also looking at updating the water supply yield throughout the state as on a decade level, and that essentially updates with as we get new population forecasts provided from another state agency. So, and then we would then evaluate the supply versus demand for public communities every 5 years to update that. So this is essentially just an evaluation statewide of water availability, identifying communities that may be in a shortfall, and then presenting that on a GIS application. We're kind of starting to do this. This is heavily involved with the Illinois State Water Survey. And they're hosting this right now, but we're kind of developing this as we speak. And this is just a plan to formalize how that will be updated and how often. Any thoughts or concerns, questions with recommendation issue number 2?
Wes, is this program currently occurring and are you just updating it more frequently? Or this is a whole new recommendation that isn't currently being completed?
It is starting, I guess it's a new initiative that we undertook within the last couple of years. We're kind of pulling it together. The first step is always the hardest, or I guess the first iteration is always the hardest, getting the framework together so that it can be easily updated. And that's the idea, is that this will essentially identify the routine of updating.
And another question, I know last month we talked about for the lead agencies that we could only have one. And I know this is tricky, and the reason I ask is because a lot of mine are DNR and State Water Survey. So ultimately we said we could only have one lead agency, so that one agency would be responsible for making sure that this particular item was implemented. So I just wanted to remind us, can we put more than one, or should we stick to the one for the agency?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Tara. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as we get into integrated water management, you know, the focus of that is that we're multiple agencies speaking as one. So it kind of preaches about multiple agency involvement. I guess that said, there would still need to be some lead, somebody having to take ownership of that on behalf of all the other collaborated efforts.
This is Chris
So
Davis.
I guess the
Is it
good
possible?
question is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. This is Chris Davis. What I was wondering is, could we just add another column to the table, one that has the lead agency identified and then has an additional agencies responsible?
We did talk about that last month, and we decided that we didn't want to limit if in case we forgot an agency, and we didn't want to be too hard. You know, some of them might be all the agencies, and it would get pretty lengthy. But it's a good idea, but I think we decided that we weren't going to proceed with that. But it can be rediscussed.
This is Walt. So this is a huge topic, by the way. There's an awful lot in this recommendation, but you know, it seems to me, so IDNR is providing most of the funding, the water survey is doing most of the technical work. So but I think DNR really is the lead agency from the sense that, you know, everything we do needs to be approved by you guys. So I'm fine with the water survey dropping out under that lead agency.
Yeah, well, that was kind of the point I was going to make next, or question I was going to throw out is the funding agency, in this case, DNR is the funding agency where the State Water Survey is really doing 99% of the heavy lifting here. But I think without DNR and without having that funding in place, that work couldn't go. So I can definitely see that we would want to list in a case where there's a funding agency required, that agency be listed as the lead. So for number 2, I would recommend we just list it as DNR as the lead. And, you know, me and you both know who does all that work. So.
Well, this is Lauren. I guess where my mind is going on this one is trying to figure out how this plays in with our Lake Michigan water allocation for a number of communities in northeastern Illinois, wherein we grant an allocation. We've said you may have this much. Some of those communities are in violation of that amount because they have such excessive leakage. I'm not sure if I'm pro or con. I'm just trying to figure out how this plays in, and if the sharing of this data creates angst, or we're going to get a lot of pushback about, well, I don't necessarily want the world knowing. It's one thing to report to the state, but putting it out there for God and everybody to see, is that going to create a lot of pushback from the users? I don't know. Had you coordinated with Jim or Jay on that? I'm not sure if those guys are on the phone this morning or not.
Yeah, Lauren, that's a step we're looking at taking. This only applies to, as far as putting information out here, this only applies to public water supply entities that would be published. So we don't publish any private entity at this time. It's open to the public. And I believe the step that we're currently looking at was showing the available supply as what their allocation has been given or has been. So I think that was the path moving forward. I assume that allocation information, at least for the public water supplies, was made public. Is that not the case? I just been trying to recall.
Well, Wes, you were really choppy there. I don't know if you changed rooms or something, but what I'm hearing is that there's a distinction between where the public water supply and the Lake Michigan allocation.
Yes, it would be that it's for public water supplies. I'm going to switch audios. I'm getting kind of multiple comments about checking this, but the idea was that we only publish public supply information.
Hello, is everybody there?
Yeah, you sound much better.
Yes, I apologize. I've switched my audio. Hopefully that takes care of that. So Lauren, to follow up on your question, what was is that for this GIS application that provides this data, this is only publishing public entities and not private. So I'm not sure if that addresses that concern or not.
No, I think it's
Again,
still
this
the public water supply, even with the allocation. I mean, we say for all water supply sources, which I guess in my mind includes all that, the Lake Michigan allocation.
Well, we can coordinate with our Lake Michigan section to see what they're comfortable with sharing publicly. We're kind of working through that now. So we can just make sure that we're mindful of that. I assume that whatever our allocation is provided publicly. Are you saying that's not public information on what IDNR gives out for allocations?
It is public. It's more of their usage, or whether they're in violation or not of what's been allocated, or and maybe they just added a huge industrial park and they haven't gotten their allocation re-upped, and so suddenly it looks like they're way under underserviced because they are now using so much more. So I guess, yeah, bottom line, let's just coordinate that with the Lake Michigan programs to make sure that the language doesn't get us in trouble there.
Hey, Lauren, this is Jim. All that information, we put out summary sheets of everybody's annual summary sheets of everybody's LMO2 data. So it has their allocation, their percent non-revenue water and how much they pumped, so a lot of that's, put out there anyways.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Okay, I see that I'm got about 10 minutes left in my time, and we're on second item. So we'll move on to number 3, try and move on here. Local collaboration. This is kind of ongoing, but just kind of formalizes it. Establish regional water supply committees throughout the state where there is sufficient local interest. Ensure data is readily available to support regional water supply committees. Add structure to regional plans to identify and report on capital improvement progress needs related to water sustainability. So essentially, this is continuation of the regional water supply planning program, which we currently have in place, and continuing an effort to develop these local or regional committees that provide feedback in how they would like to address any shortfalls or critical concerns within their area as it pertains to water supply. And it also includes the add structure. Maybe that can be reworded slightly better. Maybe it's add infrastructure or capital programs to regional plans to identify and report. This is more saying that the regional planning can also include capital improvement projects, and we would look to see if there would be potential future funding for capital improvement projects as it pertains to water supply.
This is Lauren. I guess we ask for annual funding, and it looks like you're saying for capital improvement needs. Do we need, because we fund just the regional committees to allow them to exist? Do we need to have established and fund?
Yeah, so essentially under that Flood Control Act of 45 that allows us to do flood control projects, it also allows us to do drought capital improvements as well. So, maybe that's assisting with pipeline to have a second connection for emergency backup supply. Maybe it's an expansion of a current reservoir for a small community, something along that we can essentially evaluate benefits and cost on a water supply side, as we typically do in a flood control project, and have funding potentially available to assist communities with that. Again, that would probably be prioritized with number 1 and focusing at, vulnerable communities.
Yeah, but is it the focus of this one is the committees, right? And so I'm just wondering if we need to have in this recommendation, consistently fund, because we, through the DNR, we help fund those regional committees and the work that they do for that purpose, but that's a inconsistent funding source. So I'm just wondering if, besides if we need to establish and consistently fund those committees.
So just add a phrase of consistent funding.
That would be my recommendation, yeah.
Okay, I can add that, yeah. Any other comments on number 3? Hearing none, we'll move on to number 4, is really kind of us addressing climate change as it pertains to water supply. And the one report that's significantly out of date is the evaporation study that was done for the state of Illinois that has been used for our analysis of reservoir supply communities. And essentially, this is just updating the evaporation rates. Kind of similar, we've recently updated the rainfall dates for flood purposes. This is kind of the equivalent of looking at the evaporation rates to use whenever we do an analysis for a reservoir used for surface water supply. Again, this would be coordinated through the climate change section, as it's really looking at climate change and maybe even evaluating if we look at a predictive model and how this evaporation rate changes over time. Any thoughts or comments on this? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on to number 5, low flow water protection. Work with regional water supply communities to develop state and regional strategies to implement during emergencies, including low flow stream protection. So this is something that has been, has been attempted to be passed in prior years, but the previous state water plan was to put in some kind of official language on low flow stream protection and restrictions for all streams throughout the state of Illinois. This is essentially working with regional and committees to, essentially attempt this again to see if there's a new interest in proposed legislation to protect the aquatic habitat of streams during low flow to ensure there's adequate supply for kind of the base needs of the river ecosystem. Again, this kind of coordination with the water law section, but also I think should be coordinated with the aquatic habitat section as well. Any thoughts or concerns, questions on low flow protection recommendation.
Hey, Wes, I think this is a good idea, but I noticed I struggle with this table too a little bit where you are describing the recommendation for the annual funding portion, and you are saying there's legislation, but should you put a sentence in there saying legislation is required and then say what it is so that the recommendation ties in with both of your columns?
Yeah, I question that too, because I'm not sure 100% if the solution will be a state legislation issue. You know, could this be a regional ordinance that communities within that region develop? I'm not exactly sure what the final answer to this will be. So there is some question on, you know, not having the final answer makes this a little bit difficult to predict exactly how it will flush out.
This is Lauren.
Go
go ahead.
I would just make that statement and be honest and say either pass legislation to allow this to occur or a regional ordinance. And I'm losing, if you don't state it in the recommendation, I'm not seeing that you're recommending any changes to any law.
Lauren, did you have something?
I was just going to add in maybe the word minimum before low flow stream protection. And I guess I say that because in some instances, it kind of becomes case by case. You know, if we know that there's an existing mussel bed or something, you know, that from the environmental side that might ask for something above some, you know, Q710 criteria or something that would be adopted that would require higher low flow stream protections. So we are setting a base minimum that could be adjusted based on a case by case basis or stream by stream kind of information. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was the intent, and maybe it's hard to put that detail in here. Maybe I could try and reword it slightly so it varies based on the ecosystem of that river. As we know, the Kankakee is a lot different than the Des Plaines River, and so the level of protection may need to change between those two river systems. But yeah, I'll change the wording of low flow to minimum. Just you're saying have 5 list as minimum water protection or minimum flow water protection.
Yeah, like a base in which it could go higher than that.
Okay.
How will this be implemented? Is it water withdrawal issues?
Correct. It would be, whether it be an ordinance for a community, the number of communities along, say, the Fox River would implement that, hey, we have an agreement that we're not going to pull water out of the Fox River whenever it hits this level. Or it could be a state-defined decree that this is the protection limits. And that becomes very difficult, especially as we talk about changing it over, you know, just the course of one river. That number would change drastically and it could also change over time. So there's a lot of nuances that would have to be worked out in how this would exactly be identified and implemented.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments to number 5? Hearing none, we'll move on to 6. As you may be aware, we have by the State Water Plan Task Force, it is a State Water Plan Task Force document. This is updating the Drought Preparedness and Response Plan. We've just had comments of adding some clarity to that document as far as responsibilities, authorities, and decision makings, and when those come into place, and better defining when that's implemented and who implements it. So that's just an update of that report to add clarification on when action is taken and by whom. Any questions or comments to updating that drought plan?
Wes, is that a project or a study for the far right column?
It's almost a report. A study, I assume, kind of means more of an investigation. So that's why I listed as a project. It's kind of a task to be completed. I'm open to have it listed either way. So if we have a report to update, do we think that should be listed as a project or as a study?
I would say project. It's an effort. Study to me was something brand new.
I think last month when we talked about it, because I made a few parentheses comments, and a study was supposed to be the investigation or a report, and then the project was supposed to be something we would construct. But again, we could change our definitions as we move forward.
Yeah, I'm fine with going with that language that we had, or the way we defined it last session.
Okay by me.
Any other comments to number 6 on drought plan? I just will say this report, once it's updated, will be circulated to the task force and ask for comments and stuff like that. So this will come out under the task force name, and we'll want to make sure everybody's on board with it, as there is multiple agencies that are involved with essentially the activation of the state drought task force, which is really what this document describes in details. Okay, moving on to number 7, improved data collection. We've received comments about wanting to improve metering data as it pertains to high capacity wells. Again, this would likely be an amendment to the Water Use Act of 1983, where water reporting is required by state law depending on the amount of pumpage that occurs. This has led to some debate on how they measure their water use pertaining to high capacity ground wells, and this would propose an amendment to that Water Use Act of 83 requiring water use metering for high capacity wells. This is likely to get a lot of kickback, and I don't know if this is going to be a straightforward or an easy recommendation to implement it, and maybe we find that there's too much interest opposed to this idea, but it has been something that's been shared with our group that would be of interest. Any thoughts to this?
Are we talking about just big players here? I guess when you say high capacity, so these are communities or large industry. We're not talking about ma and pa as well.
Correct. This is high capacity is defined as 0.1 million gallons per day or greater. So it won't be your local private well, but it's high capacity well users. We do have, this will typically be communities. This will also be farm irrigators as well that use a large quantity of water.
This is Greg Good. I would only say for this one, because I'm not overly familiar with the issues that, so from kind of an outsider looking in, just the one sentence isn't providing me enough of a explanation, I guess, of what the recommendation really might be. I know we're trying to keep these recommendations for each of the issues within kind of a 2-page limit, which I found incredibly difficult so far in trying to draft up a water quality issues paper, but this one doesn't, number 7 doesn't give, I think, the reader enough, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know if there's an extra sentence that can do that without.
Just out of curiosity, Greg, where's the confusion coming in? Is that the definition of a high capacity well? Is it what is a metering requirement? What clarifications specifically are you looking for?
Exactly those two things. Yeah. And I'm frankly, I'm not familiar with the Water Use Act of '83 either. So, I we can't get into too much detail on the recommendations, I know, but so if somebody comes back and reads this and says, what does this recommendation mean? Do they have to find Wes and call up Wes in order to find out what this recommendation really meant?
Is there a citation that you could point people to that defines high capacity wells so that they could go look it up?
Yeah, it's in the Water Use Act of 1983. It defines what a high capacity well is.
And I had the same thing jump out at me that Greg did. Who is this going to impact? And that's where, the kickback will come from. These documents are our professional opinions based on experience and knowledge of what we think should happen. Worrying about kickback, that'll just come later, and so be it.
Yeah, and essentially those who, it says improve the accuracy, so it kind of infers those who are already supposed to be reporting. Hopefully they're already aware of this and know that. So it's not saying expanding the water use. So those who it impacts, they probably are familiar with what this means, but someone outside of that may not have a clear understanding without doing some additional investigation. So, we can add clarification just as Tara's kind of showing on the screen. We could denote that that's 0.1 MGD.
When I read it and you said legislation, I immediately thought you were going to be imposing something upon people that was not currently being required.
Well, yeah, I think that's why I wanted to stress improve the accuracy and not add a requirement. Do we think that just adding that 0.1 MGD as shown is enough clarification, or do we need to add to existing high capacity well users?
Wes, I'm not familiar with this either, and I think my question is, are you adding metering requirements? Because right now there are none. Are you adding better meters to measure the water use? So I think if just clarifying that might help as well.
And maybe I should state that adding water metering requirements. Currently, some are using the electric meter to estimate their water usage. So we could clarify that by stating a water meter. And I can defer to my committee to see how we want to best identify that.
Do you want to say adding or improving?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's all we could say, improving. And I know some others, Walter, on here. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the Water Use Act doesn't really say anything about, the accuracy or how to report. And this is kind of really aimed more at the irrigation industry who tend to want to just estimate how much water they use. And we're finding that the data are not very good. And many other states have this requirement. I think all the adjacent states to Illinois require meters on their high capacity wells. So we just thought we should be doing what other states are doing to get the best data we can.
Now I can work with Walt a little bit further on, maybe we say direct, improve direct metering, something of that line instead of estimated. But we can try and clean this up a little bit.
So Wes, to be picky with the table, you picked for funding to be evaluated, and that was not one of your three choices. But I understand what the issue is. You don't know cost.
Correct, so we don't know if we'll need to fund this or not. So I'd propose that we can say to be evaluated as a funding item. To get this through legislatively, we may be required to fund metering or funding those meters for large, I don't know. I see this being, to be honest, I think the Farm Bureau is not going to want to go along with this, and we may have to supplement this somehow. Is anybody opposed to using to be evaluated as an evaluation and funding? Or to be determined? Unknown.
I think evaluated or determined works.
Okay, I'll change it to say to be determined. Any other comments to item number 7, the improved data collection? I'll pause just for a moment in case anybody has any further comments. Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to number 8, which is public education improvement. Improve public outreach and education on state agencies' roles and responsibilities regarding water supply. I think there's some misunderstanding of which agency is in charge of what as it pertains to water. So maybe this would be a section incorporated into the integrated water management recommendation of the data portal, essentially, to identify what agencies are in charge of what, who you need to contact for various water issues. You know, if you have to drill a well, who do you need to reach out to, things like that. So I think there's just been some confusion from the public that we received regarding which agency is in charge of what as it pertains to water. So this recommendation would be providing resources to clarify that. Any comments or concerns with number 8?
Les, I had the opportunity to read through Lauren's, and he has a whole item in the integrated water management about this very topic. And I guess I'm wondering, it maybe when we talk about Lauren's, now that I'm looking at our columns, does DNR get that funding? Or does that water, Illinois Water Group get that funding? So that's just something we need to think about as we move forward, because there's several agencies involved, and does that water center get the funding, or does DNR? We just need to think that through.
Yeah, I don't know if we have to work out that level of detail at this stage of saying who gets what amount of funding or who gets what funding. You know, I think that will kind of get worked out in Lauren's section as we talk about that Illinois Flood Center or whatever, how that outreach will be conducted. And again, this could almost be pulled out of this section because I think it kind of falls to everybody's and it's almost too generic of a recommendation, but I wanted to throw it on here just to introduce it to the group and share it. So I guess my first question is, do we just pull this out as it's a very vague statement, although we could put it in everyone's section. I don't know if that would be necessary. And I guess the question is, I don't know if we need to identify who's receiving the funding at this point. I guess that's my thoughts.
Yeah, this is Lauren. I like the idea of having it in each section, but also, yeah, it becomes kind of a undetailed generic one. So maybe we talk about that in the integrated water management, because really we could be saying, you know, public education on all 13 of our topics probably.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought as I read this, but I think that there is a need to clarify to the public as far as what agencies' responsibilities are, and maybe some kind of guidance on who they need to contact based on what their specific issue is.
Can we change the recommendation then to be more specific as to what it's recommending then? I mean, as it is, it's just kind of general, but I mean, you've got some specific ideas in mind.
Well, I don't think we want to limit it to just those specific activities, though, is what we're saying, is that it's almost too general, as it is kind of a broad statement. But I think the essence of this is that we need to communicate to the general public who they need to be in contact with regarding what their specific issue is. I could speak to this as only a water sustainability point, but I think that would only be a small piece of this.
Well, Wes, what I'm hearing, I think I agree a little bit with who just spoke, that this will be in the integrated water management, but you change this recommendation. I don't want to delete it from your section, and then maybe it's a one-time funding where you develop a brochure or a website explaining the roles and responsibilities. It's a one-time thing, but it can be used by this overall outreach and education that will be discussed in the integrated water management, that you actually develop a exact information regarding this issues, because I think it's important and I don't want you to lose it by deleting it.
Well, to be honest, I'm kind of honestly, as we talk through it, thinking about deleting it, because I think every single section is going to have that task of providing some general information about what their agency does, when they need to be contacted as it pertains to various issues. So, I mean, unless we want to specifically list this for every single issue, it just seems almost too generic of a topic. It's one that I think it's worth having in the report. I just don't think this is the place to have it.
I think let's stick a pin in that, and because I think we can talk about this as we continue through each of the topics and try to decide at the end how we deal with the education. I do kind of like the idea of maybe, you know, a specific within, say, you know, the water supply one about developing specific education outreach activities about water conservation, or about groundwater withdrawals, or some specific that would be this 5-year focus. But for now, I guess I'll suggest let's stick a pin in it and see how we discuss this on the remaining topics.
Yeah, that's fine, Lauren. I'm okay with that. But just know that even within water sustainability, I could probably list at least a dozen topics that would need to be included with that, as it just pertains to water sustainability. So, but again, I think we can continue this discussion on the under integrated management. With that, you know, we already discussed pulling number 9 off, as that's kind of been already addressed within the past couple of years. So I guess I will just see if anybody has any final comments as it pertains to the water sustainability section.
Yeah, this is Brian Cox with IDPH, and I was just going to point out that there's not really any mention of water conservation practices or water harvesting practices. I know from an IDPH perspective, that's been kind of a big topic over the last 4 years. And so I think it might be worthwhile to add something along the lines of improving water conservation and water harvesting practices.
Brian, do you want to just kind of maybe send me some language about what you would maybe propose that to be? I think, you know, I guess I know we have water sense and quite a few water conservation initiatives already underway, but if you feel there's some ways that we need to improve that, I'll be interested to hear. We're actually, in Illinois, our water use has actually gone down over the past decade, so call that population, call that water conservation. But if there is some additional recommendations that you think is worthwhile, I'll be happy to consider them, and we can maybe talk about putting those in to this section.
Yeah, definitely. I can do that, because we get a lot of inquiries specifically about the water harvesting projects, where you're talking about rerouting gray water and using that for irrigation purposes. And from a regulatory perspective, that presents quite a few challenges. And so it can cross-cut from IDPH to IEPA as well. And so I think it is worthy of addressing that, because typically when we get these types of projects, people are requesting approval of them. They are challenging to approve, and so they're being done with the thought or hope that they're being a good steward for water sustainability. However, we're oftentimes required to deny those requests and or put different conditions on there that they consider to be overly burdensome. And so I think it'd be worthwhile to include it in this.
Yeah, great comment, Brian. I appreciate you recommending that. Like I said, we can work together to see if we would maybe add something to address conservation. So yeah, please send me some language that you think would be worthwhile, or even a row that would kind of fit into this table, and we can coordinate and move forward from there.
All right, thank you.
Anything else? So last comments, water sustainability. Okay, I want to thank you all. Got some great recommendations in here, some great feedback and comments. So we'll work on implementing those. And I will go ahead and hand it off to Tara as she talks about flood damage mitigation.
Okay, I brought up Lauren's just because I'm sure most of you didn't get a chance to look at this. And I'm just throwing this out there because what my group's been struggling with, I'm just going to pull this down. When Lauren talked about his recommendations, and I don't know if this is final or how he's going to go forward, we've already had this conversation in previous meetings, but I just wanted us to be thinking about it again, because in his recommendations, he really describes the specifics of what his plan includes. And then when he gets to his table, he just has a one-line sort of summary. So we've talked, the table, does it represent everything, or does it just represent, I struggle because ours are quite long, and ours need description just to explain what we're saying. So do we want to go back to what Lauren's doing here a little bit with much more description about his recommendations and then using the table as a summary? So just that's a pin for discussion if we have time at the end. Also want to mention Lauren grabbed a previous iteration of another table, and I sort of like this one better. So again, when we talk about Lauren's, be thinking about how we can pull that in if we so choose. So that said, this is my section, flood damage mitigation. And just a quick overview, we just talked about the prevalence of flooding in Illinois. We've got a couple graphics showing all the damages throughout the state. And then we also talk about how climate change has been impacting rain events in the state. So then we go into issues, and we actually divide it into 3 categories. That first we have to identify the flooding. And then we actually had equity as one of our main issues, that how we can address those. And just one thing I wanted to mention, when we do our improvements, back to what Wes was talking about for his first one, we've been trying to roll those into each recommendation. Any way we can bring in equity, social, and environmental justice into our recommendations specifically. So again, maybe a pin as to how do we keep that as a separate item, or do we roll them into our specific recommendations? And then the third main issue for us was once we've identified those flooding and to determine who should get the funding for improvements to actually go ahead and mitigate the flooding. So I just sort of described each one of those categories a little bit more, the hazard identification, and then social justice, and then we talked about where things need to be mitigated. So then we get into our recommendations. Again, just a little brief overview as to why we need to make improvements. But I think I'll just go ahead and get into the guts of the table. And I'm going to go ahead and start with item 1. Our recommendation is, and it definitely cross-cuts with climate change, that we want to have a new study to update precipitation records showing some of those climate change impacts. But what we've also found is that land use has changed over time, and that impacts our flood risk. So all studies and rainfall data needs to make sure that we incorporate land use changes. So what we're suggesting is to have a one-time funded for a study that predicts some of these long-term climate change impacts of rainfall predictions. We just had Bulletin 75 come out, and that's definitely a step in the right direction. It's utilizing more recent data, and it is showing higher rainfall in certain areas of the state. But we also recognize that that report was not able to bring in climate change predictions. So we definitely, the recommendation for Bulletin 75 was to update it every 15 years. So we went ahead and added that as a recommendation for that this particular climate change study or report would be updated every 15 years. So I do have a question before I open it up. This is a one-time funding for this study, but when I want to update it in 15 years, can I put one time every 15 years? You know, it doesn't fit our column heading. So any comments on item 1?
To me, one time is okay because we've kind of said that this is a 5-year focused plan. So, you know, having it be a one-time thing every 5 years or so, so be it. I'm just on number 1. I'm also wondering if, you know, you mentioned the Bulletin 75. Does it need to go into basically supplementing Bulletin 75 with the climate variability rainfall predictions? Do we say something to that effect, like you just mentioned?
We weren't sure. We originally had that this would be an update to the Bulletin 75, but then we felt like that took so long we just weren't sure. We're curious what this group thinks, if it should be a supplement to that or if it should be its own standalone report. I don't know if it matters at this point, but I agree it could go either way.
I guess I see this more as a supplement to Bulletin 75 since that date is only, well, trying to think of when it was published exactly. It may be coming up on 5 years already. I don't think so, but, you know, I see this being as a supplement as it looks, you know, particularly at that predicted future rainfall. One question I had is it talked about future land use projections. And I'm wondering, the current Bulletin 75 doesn't look at existing land use as it comes up with its rainfall predictions. Are you proposing that land use has a significant impact on rainfall?
Yes, and I think that was a comment from our committee that needs to be addressed. We're addressing rainfall, but not land use changes over time.
So I can see land use impacting runoff, but not necessarily rainfall. But your committee's making comment that rainfall itself is impacted by land use? I guess
no,
this is just...
No runoff. Runoff is impacted. I'm not sure now that you say that, but I think the idea was that certain areas, or maybe it's more in the models, but you're right. I'm not sure exactly how that this falls.
Yeah, I would just say that may lead to some confusion as rainfall is usually independent of land use. And if we were talking about runoff, that would be something different. So I would almost recommend removing the land use issues unless we're talking about, you know, mapping updates or runoff updates. But since we're talking about updating precipitation, I don't think that our analysis in precipitation would be directly related to land use.
It almost could become
fair.
its own separate recommendation of a need for an update, regular update of statewide land use that could be used for, you know, runoff studies and hydrologic hydraulic studies.
I'm trying to figure out what part of land use you think is not being updated, because the Illinois Department of Agriculture, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the U.S. Geological Survey collaborate, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service collaborate on the national map. And through satellite data, they compile land cover, which is different than land use, but land cover maps that we do use in hydrologic modeling for future runoff scenarios. So,
Yeah. Laura, I think the crux of this, it says future land use projections.
yeah.
So I think they're saying that if we're going to have future rainfall predictions, those also need to accompany future land use projections. And like Lauren said, I think this is almost a separate issue. I think we do have good current land use data, but as to my knowledge, we don't have any forecasted or future land use data.
Yeah, it's almost like with the regional water supply planning, trying to get people to determine what their future water use is going to be. I'm not sure how it will almost be the same process.
Yeah, it's really working with the regional planning councils.
Yeah, and I think the intent, I agree, it could be separate. Unfortunately, we have a lot of issues and we had to really pare down. So I think at the end we started trying to put a few things in at one time. But back to that, I think I can go back to the committee and explain what you guys suggested and see how we want to handle that. But I think back to the future land use projections, it's just to make sure, maybe what you're saying, Laura, yeah, we're using existing data, but we know there's future development in certain areas and determining, making sure that we're planning for those future land uses when we do our modeling. It's tricky. So I think that's why we wanted it evaluated. Okay, any other comments on item 1? Okay, item 2, we currently, Water Survey has a database that shows all the regulation models, hydraulic models and flood studies and such. So what our group was suggesting that we update that database to include all the hydraulic models, and that would be all regulatory, non-regulatory, anything that's sort of been completed for the state in terms of hydraulic models. But then again, I had the privilege of reading Lauren's, and he has recommended, so maybe he should have gone first, but that they're recommending an Illinois Water Center in their an integrated management section, and it has all kinds of these same recommendations that we're recommending for the floods. So I want to keep them as recommendations because they're important, but we can all recognize that some of this will be addressed in Lauren's section as well. But I also put as a cross-cutting issue the data management. I have to work with Laura on this. It might cross-cut. I know she's turned her section into more stream data management, so maybe this may or may not be included in her section. But again, the idea is just to have a repository for all the models. Every different agencies have done them. We know a lot of communities are doing modeling on their own for planning purposes, and not all of them meet the regulatory requirements and the length of time required to get those approved. But it's really good information, and if we all have to wait till the regulatory ones get published, we're missing a big group of really good information out there. So any questions or comments?
Tara, I'll make a comment that the State Water Survey doesn't have a complete list of FEMA approved models. We have a partial list based on the ones that the CHAMP group has been involved with producing. And of course, we have a historical archive that has paper copies of studies that go back to the original, card punches and Act 2 printouts and so forth that are incomplete, but can sometimes contain information. But just to clarify your comment there that yes, we do keep track of certain of them, but we will not claim to be a repository at this point for sure.
I have another question then. I originally had this as be DNR. This is where it gets tricky. DNR might get the funding and then we would contract with water survey. And again, we'll just have to see how this all shakes out in the future. Is DNR ultimately the responsible one? Because 99% of the work will be done by water survey. So we can change that later as we decide how we want to do that.
Hey,
Any
Tara,
other comments? Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, Tara, it's Rick. Looking at the list here of models and developed by the various agencies, I guess there might be a challenge to acquire and then publish some of the privately developed models, especially if those were developed with private funding and such. So when we say all hydraulic models, we may need to define exactly what that would include. Those private models might have to be acquired voluntarily by those, say, private entities who have developed the models themselves. They may wish not to share that. So just a thought there as we list private. I assume that was the intent under the private category, would be those developed by independent organizations or engineering firms and such.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we can rephrase that, but that was the intent, that if they wanted that information shared, since they've got it and they think it would be useful, but you're right, it would need to be voluntary.
Well, but it could still be a database of all, right? And so we could ask Wobig engineering firm to provide, to let us know that, a model was created on Sally Creek for this community. It doesn't have to provide the model, but it could just be asterisks that, that model is out there in the state of Illinois and is currently held by Wobig Enterprises or whatever.
That's kind of
It
what I
may
was
entice them that they could get additional funding for work that they've already done to be able to effectively sell that model if they were able to.
Correct. Yeah. Then you might get participation because now you've given an incentive that folks know that, Wobig Enterprises holds that model.
Yeah, maybe some basic metadata, like, what model was used, what version, when was it created and updated, things like that, so people can know maybe how old it is or what it was developed in, things of that nature. And then, yeah, pointing, then you can go to these people and with this contact info, and that might be easier to do than collecting models.
I see this being a great opportunity. It'd be a lot of work, but to put this in a GIS application that you click on a stream and it could tell you what models are available. Again, that's a lot of work, but as we move into a lot of geo-referenced models, it may be easier and easier to develop. Just something to consider.
And those are all great ideas. I think we'll just have to expand this one a little bit, but I think that's what we were thinking, but it's sort of hard to describe all those. But if we can try and rephrase this to cover that, but that was what our intent was, is a single source location to know where the latest models are. And like you've all said, it might not be the model itself uploaded in the database, but I also struggle within the state. We've all, even within the Office of Water Resources, we've done models for different planning and some projects, but are we sharing that with anyone? So we just want to make sure that everyone knows what's been done to date. I'm going to move to and that this particular one is just really feeds off of, it's still part of our identification, but we know that we have old models, we have areas that haven't been modeled. So we're saying to continue updating modeling, but we're also suggesting that maybe we don't go to the full extent of regulatory modeling due to the length of time and the money involved, but just to explore some advances in technology and utilize some new sources. A lot of us are using LiDAR, looking at photos maybe to estimate first floor elevations and things like that. To go ahead and we can use these models as long as they're identified. I've talked with Water Survey. They're also looking at this idea of doing a little bit more, we're calling them coarser models, where they might be good for planning or for determining where to expend funds. So this one is just continuing modeling, but also maybe looking at it from a new approach, and then uploading all those models that we do from here forward into that database from number 2.
Well, and this is Lauren, I can speak because I happen to have a white and a black hat in my office. And so from the planning side, I really like the idea of, having that information and there. And that's great for looking at what ifs and generating concepts and options. But ultimately, if you select something that ends up having to go through the regulatory process, you will end up having to use a regulatory model to do that.
And I think that's fine. And I think what we were thinking is you do some of these coarser ones, but then you determine where the problem areas are. And then from there, those will help us determine which areas need more complex modeling or more detailed modeling.
Yes, Chair, I'll add to that comment. The Water Survey is looking at the idea of doing statewide coverage of 2D HEC-RAS modeling using, available LiDAR data and using the the rain on grid approach for the hydrology, which is integrated within the HEC-RAS system. So there's basically new tools that are easily available and usable now that would allow for that type of study to be done sort of as a high level or first pass approach to any waterway or surface waterway that could then be used to help inform a more detailed study, planning out how cross sections would be laid out if it was a 1D model, or looking at areas that have a smaller drainage area or watershed than what the normal 1 square mile or 10 square mile cutoffs might be for FEMA or the state.
Any other comments on item 3? Okay, moving on to item 4, again, for identification. Ideally, in a perfect world, we'd like to have inundation mapping for all communities in the state, and we'd love to see that in a website, sort of like what Wes was getting at, that you can click on an area and this would be a live model that you could plug in a different flood elevation or a flood event, a flood stage, and it would show you what gets flooded, a visual. And so once we develop this website, it would be a little bit like our SAFER website, which I'll talk about for the next item. But this would have some features that would allow the community to download information as well as reports or information packets, because we recognize not everyone is digital or web savvy. So we want to make sure that we've also got materials that can be hard copies. And then we do need to keep that inundation mapping updated. So we need to continue updating that mapping and website after with flood information that we receive after a flood event, or if an area gets mitigated, then we need to update those inundation mapping. So it's going to be a long-term, big effort, but it would be a start. And any questions on that item?
So, Tara, my only question is, how feasible is it to have some kind of sustainable program that we have? Is this done for the entire state? And the upkeep and management of that, what what kind of resources does that take, and do we see that as being something that can be sustained? You know, how often are we needing to reevaluate this? I just see this being a very big lift. Not that it's not a good recommendation, but my concern is how easily can it be implemented?
And I don't know the answers to that. Thankfully, we are not putting how much things cost because I really don't have an idea of that. But I think once the inundation mapping has been generated, and that has been getting more and more using scripts and using data that's already readily available. And so I think the big lift would be making flood and inundation mapping for all the communities. But at some point, maybe we have to pull in the equity here. Do we do it for the social equity, work on those vulnerable communities first? Those are the ones most impacted by flooding. Obviously, we would have to have some priority list to decide, like we did with the SAFER, do we want to do the big rivers and then just march across the state? I don't know how feasible it is, but I think once it got started, it wouldn't be as hard to maintain. But getting the whole state covered, maybe we don't do the whole state, but only problem areas. I'm not exactly sure.
All of these seem to be like teasers for the integrated water management. So thank you for playing up my topic there. But could this be creating a database similar to what we were just talking about? A database for where this inundation mapping is available. Obviously, it could become that repository as well of the existing inundation mapping, but it could be generating this overall, GIS or kind of a database of where inundation mapping is available and or is necessary. Does it identify those perhaps disadvantaged communities that are still in need of inundation risk identification mapping?
Yeah, I see that going in with the Illinois Water Center, that all this information is in that whole repository of information. But we wanted this to be more of a visual, not just where do you get the inundation mapping. We want to show them the inundation mapping. We want them to be able to look at it, look at their area and see it. So it's not just a repository of what's done. We want it to actually run inundation depth grids for different communities and be able to show them. But you're right, some has been completed. We can pull that information in, but a lot of it needs to be done. I think my only other concern, within 5 years, this will be one of those long-term 15-year plans. So back to what Wes said, how sustainable is it? How much does it cost? I don't know, but I'm fairly new to the state. I figure if you don't ask, you're not going to get anything. So I do want to keep this particular item.
So do we, given a 5-year focus here, do we refine this recommendation to be, to create this database and website for inundation mapping, with a goal to have it be statewide to do the things you say here? That gives it a very specific, we can't have it until we create it and get it up and running. So that's a very kind of metricable, can we get it in the next 5 years? Can we get it created and up and running?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's a good approach.
I'll add one other thought, which would be, for instance, the flooding that we saw happen in Gibson City a few weeks ago. Most of that damage and flooding was not within the riverine areas that are in the flood insurance rate maps that FEMA produces. They're the urban flooding or fluvial style flooding. flash flooding. There's lots of names for it, but the water survey did a quick and dirty evaluation of that event using a 2D model with a rain on grid and approach, modeling the specific storm event with NextRad rainfall data, producing results that were very similar to what was experienced. But that was an effort that was not very difficult overall, but it could be something that is in the repertoire of the state to do in other locations as it happens, or as part of other outreach activities for here's what could happen, with the way that climate is adjusting now. And so if it wasn't over the whole state, it could be in select areas potentially.
And you've spoiled us now.
Thanks, Glenn. And
Glenn, we expect that for every community after a flood.
Well, we would love to do that too. I mean, it's actually fun. Well, not fun. It's scientifically fun, let's just say, but it is concerning every time that we see those things happen. But yeah, it seems like that it would be a real benefit for Illinois citizens to have quick information available, but even better if they have it before the event.
Well, just a quick question. How long did that take to develop? Just out of curiosity.
The Gibson City event it took about a day of engineering time, and then we had some time putting together some of the documentation and the story map. But it was a light effort, but part of that was because we were already working in Ford County with a FEMA project. We already had information at our fingertips and funding to do that Ford County work. So we were already operating there under the FEMA umbrella. But where there is LiDAR available, where there is, the available resources are important, let's just say. But I think that it still is a realistic thing to be able to do with a relatively minimal effort and relatively little lead time.
thanks, Glenn. And I think when we were developing this, I had conversations with him just last week, and it did just the way they've been writing all this data that's available, and then these Python scripts that can generate these inundation maps for a multitude of different flood grids. It sounds like it's definitely progressing in the direction we want to go in terms of time required and maybe funding associated with it. Any other comments on item 4? Okay, so item 5, again, we're still identifying floods. Right now, we do have a website called Safer Structures at Flood Risk, and we are slowly going through and doing flood damage assessments utilizing Silver Jackets projects, as well as some other community projects with a State Water Survey and OWR. And I'm just suggesting that we continue this effort. We continue doing those Silver Jackets projects, but we might do other non-Silver Jacket projects just to get the whole state covered on this website. And eventually we envision it would be all housed in that Illinois Water Center. This would be, the Safer site would be tied in with our item 4 inundation mapping. And this GIS web-based information would be available to communities and decision makers. So what we're asking specifically for this is just to continue funding those studies and then utilize these studies to help come up with a statewide mitigation priority list, which is a later recommendation for our group. So any questions on this? All right, I'm going to go ahead and move up. Our next category was equity. And this seems to be a concern with some of our committee members that the public's very confused about flood insurance. And a big issue is that some people aren't in the floodplain at all, so they don't know that they can get flood insurance for that as well, especially if they're outside the MAP floodplain. So I'm not exactly sure how to make this happen, but what they wanted to do was to come up with some materials, and this goes to what Wes was saying, to explain to people what this is all about flood insurance, and coming up with some sort of pamphlet or information to share with the insurance agents. So I actually said that we would generate guidance materials or outreach materials. And then we share those with the agents and with communities. And then it's really focusing on those vulnerable populations that don't even know that they might be impacted by either riverine or urban flooding. And then to piggyback on this, I don't know enough about the legislation, but what the committee is wanting that legislation to require property sales to disclose both sewer backup, more in the urban flooding, if you're in a floodplain, or provide mapping showing if it's outside the floodplain. So we know that this, when I read Lauren's local assistance in his integrated management, he's talking about those materials and getting out to the public and talking to them. This could tie in definitely with his local assistant, but we think there's one-time funding to generate the guidance material. And then we also feel like there might be some legislation required to disclose during property sales. So any questions?
This is Lauren. I guess a comment that I would maybe add in, work with the Illinois Department of Insurance to do that, because then they might become the state agency, but it becomes more of the point on that, carrying that mission out after we've generated some guidance materials.
Sure, thank you. All right, any other comments on item 6? All right, item number 7 again is equity. What we're hearing from the committee is that in order to get the HUD funds or the FEMA BRIC funding, that the communities need to have list their flood protection and mitigation needs and their action plans or their county hazard plans. And if they don't do that, they're not eligible for this funding. So we feel that especially the vulnerable communities do not know to do this. So again, we're providing some staffing or to work with communities for outreach to explain that this needs to occur the year before in order to get the funding or to be eligible for funding. It's a very specific need and very detailed. It might be too detailed for the needs of the state water plan, but it was a big issue from people on our committee. And it definitely ties into Lauren's integrated local assistance program. Any questions?
Tara, I'll just comment that the State Water Survey is working with several communities right now to help them with their hazard mitigation plans. And so we've been involved with that. It's a bit of a uphill slog to get that worked out as far as dealing with the federal grants and going through IEMA. IEMA is the holder of the funding from the federal agencies. But going through the process with IEMA is possibly could be more streamlined, or the way that works could be improved, I suppose. in our opinion. But whatever the aspect of working with the communities on their hazard mitigation plans, it does need to include the Illinois Emergency Management Agency in that effort.
Thanks, Glenn. We'll try to add that into this recommendation. All right, any other comments on item 7? Okay, next is mitigation. That was our third main category for recommendations. And this goes back to, we wanted to, personally, Wes, before you even say, I don't know if this is sustainable, how much it's going to cost. It might be one of those pie in the sky things, but we need a database of what infrastructure, mitigative infrastructure is in the state. And then, of course, we would love to know the condition of that infrastructure. And then once we get that database going, we want to develop a priority list of upgrades needed. And we want to focus on the socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. And we want to update the priority list annually. So there's a lot in that one. Then we also want to share that information with the county officials when they develop their action plans.
I was only laughing a little bit at that, Tara, just so you know. And the only reason that gets mentioned is because, you know, as we publish this report, I see us doing very short, brief annual updates to our progress. And so we have to be a little mindful of biting off more than we can chew for the next 5 years and what we think we can reasonably implement. Because I see us saying, well, the public's going to ask, where are you at on this? You said you were going to do it. Do we think this is something we can implement? So I'm not going to echo the same comment, but just something to keep in mind for everybody as we develop these recommendations that, you know, we look to have likely status update reports maybe annually on these as we move past the publication of this report and evaluating what we think is achievable in the next 5 to 10 years. So,
I
but
know.
Tara, feel free to keep.
Go ahead.
Hey, Tara, it's Chris. Hey, would something like this be appropriate to maybe whittle down to a pilot project to do a certain region, and then you're not promising the entire state, but you're getting movement going forward to where you want to get to?
Well, Chris, I think you have a great mind because that's what I was just going to say. I think it sort of goes back to what Lauren suggested is we have to create the database and sort of set up the guts of where it's going to go in the future. But I like the idea of a pilot area and then expand it for the state in future state water plans. Thank you.
And I'll say carry on.
Any other comments?
Lots of beautiful minds, right? I wondered if this is almost a variant of the SAFER website. Because I think we would have, do we not have, you know, we would have first floor elevations and I think the type of structure in those areas where we've done that work, to me, this is kind of all of that, just absent the risk assessment or the economic information with that.
Yeah, I can see that, but I think where the group was going with this was mitigative projects that have been done in the past to prevent flooding, which might be levees. I know I don't even want to use that word in this section, but talking about the levees and any stormwater management techniques that have done infrastructure that's in place to reduce flooding. We need some sort of a recognition or a database, a list of what infrastructure is there today and that condition, and then how to prioritize. Do we fix that infrastructure or do we build new? All that is all tied in here, and I don't know, it's a big ask.
Yeah, okay, I was misunderstanding that. Thanks for clarifying that. That makes more sense now.
Okay. But if someone has that database out there that I'm just not aware of, that'd be great. So just share it with me after the call. All right, any other comments on 8?
Yeah,
I know
Tara, I
we're
can see
running out
this
of
being
time.
something that you could definitely talk to Jason with from our office, as he oversees the operation and maintenance of our projects and maybe building it out from there.
Okay, thank you. All right, I just realized we're already at 11. I don't want to cut Lauren off. So moving on to item 9, if we ever prioritize what infrastructure is needed, basically we're just suggesting we need to go ahead and do that work, provide upgrades to some of the existing infrastructure, develop new, and the committee was very concerned that they really want us to focus on natural options, green infrastructure, and then also looked on typical mitigation, the ones that we're currently doing. We just want to make sure that we continue getting funding, and we need more funding. And then one way we brought in socioeconomic or equity into this was just that some of this funding needs to be focused on the disadvantaged areas by either using a designated grant for disadvantaged areas or in the scoring of determining who gets the funding, that they get more points. So any questions on this item? Again, this is big. We may have to cut off a chunk of this and what could reasonably happen in 5 years. Okay, moving on to item 10. This one is a big one, and this is our committee really put their heart into this one. I don't know exactly how it will move forward, but it really ties in with Lauren's local assistance program, where different agencies go out and help specific communities. And the way we suggested was to add some new staffing to go ahead and provide guidance and grant application support. That seems to be a big need. That was from our public outreach. A lot of people were saying there's grants out there, but only certain wealthy communities are getting those grants because they know how to apply and they know how to play the game. So we're just providing this guidance group. Our group came up with an idea to develop a guidance group made up of volunteer experts, but that have all kinds of different qualifications, not just the scientists and engineers, but bringing in a lot of those other public entities, a lot of wealth of information out there, but have this guidance group, and that group can help generate some of those outreach materials, and then also include in that, because it's such a large, diverse group of interests, they might have good information on how to do watershed level planning, because that seems to be a big push from my committee, and how to incorporate some of those green or natural alternatives. And then that group, and Lauren will be talking about this, looking at new funding alternatives, crowdsourcing or private-public partnerships. Just utilize that group of experts for some of this outreach. So I know it's complicated. I'm not sure exactly how to go forward with it, but we felt that there's a need, that there's a lot of educational outreach required, and we didn't know how to get that to occur. So this is what we came up with.
This is Lauren. I guess I would, staying consistent with some of the comments that we've talked about already in your section, that, do we create a pilot program? Do we pick a particular area and give this thing a test drive? That way, that kind of creates something, and has kind of a test of it that could then, in future water plans, develop into full out programs. So I wonder if we yeah, bite off more of a smaller bite that gets us on the right track and gives something that could actually have some wheels to it.
Sounds perfect.
Tara, this is Greg Good. I have a question on the funding. There's been a lot of these recommendations where we say annual funding is needed, annual funding is needed. Some of these recommendations, like potentially this one, are you saying this is currently available annual funding needed, or is it new funds needed? We can only implement these recommendations if new funds are provided by the state. Kind of caught me when we were saying that any and all these recommendations we're going to have, if we say IEPA or IDNR, then there's going to be these annual or biannual, what did we do in the last year or two with respect to these recommendations? But so many, I'm sure, are going to be contingent upon new funds, new staff, et cetera. So do we need a new funding category that says new funds needed, new funds need to be appropriated, as opposed to what we all have in our current coffers?
No, that's a good point, Greg. And since we only had those three alternatives, we had annual funding, one-time funding, or no funding. And I think all of our, I need, for this particular item, I needed annual funding for that staffing to provide that guidance and do that outreach. But I think in a previous one, I have continued funding, but sometimes I need more funding. I want you to continue funding the program, but I want more. So I would even suggest we either need new annual funding, more annual funding as two new categories.
Or to be determined. To cover Wes, I think, on that previous one. Yeah, I found that, and then trying to draft something up for water quality, that sometimes I didn't feel those three categories were enough to choose from. So.
Well, I think we'll put a pin on that, and we can discuss in the future as we move forward with these tables. But I think that those are good points. Okay, my item 11 is that a lot of the people on my committee were very concerned about watershed level. We need to look at the big picture of any flood management, mitigation, planning efforts that occur, because as we all know, one thing that one community does has a direct impact on those downstream. And the committee felt that the partnerships should be developed by watershed, and we could provide some sort of incentive to communities that develop these partnerships. And it will focus on the whole entire ecosystem functionality is the word that, or the buzzword that our group is using. And again, when we develop we provide these grants to communities to make this partnership, we do want to focus some of those grants on those vulnerable or socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. So any comments on this?
A question, I guess, maybe to Chris, is this kind of a spin-off or an expansion of a 319 program?
It's possible. One of the things I was going to bring up was the term watershed means different sizes to different groups. Some people use it for the 8-digit hydrologic unit codes. Others use it for the 12-digit HUCs, and there's a significant size difference there on what we're encouraging. So we might want to define what area you're going for. But I think a thing that would fit nicely with this is the effort to try to do watershed-based planning in conjunction and inclusion of the hazard mitigation plans. We've been trying to push a few communities or watersheds to combine the two together, and that way they would qualify for not only grant funds from Illinois EPA and US EPA, but also from IEMA and FEMA. So yeah, I might be able to help you tweak that a little bit to push it towards that way, which I think probably the best incentive for them is to say you're going to go to the top of the list for these different programs if you've accomplished this planning effort.
Great. That sounds exactly where we wanted to go with this. Thank you. And then I think our last item again is providing natural and green infrastructure. A lot of the committee members felt that there's no incentive to any communities to provide those types of solutions. But one thing they felt like some of the regulations, specifically in DOT, they really don't even necessarily allow green solutions. So one of those was to update the regulations and standards to allow them. But then we also want to incentivize green design. So I wasn't sure if this was policy or legislation. So I do need input from you guys if we were to update regulations. And I know there's a lot of agencies involved. But basically, when we design any infrastructure to prevent floods, we want people to consider some of these sustainable and green designs as well. So does anyone have any suggestions?
Tara, we had done a study or had funded a study, and it's probably been 2010 or 2011 already, specifically to try to figure out ways to get more green infrastructure implemented throughout the state of Illinois. So I will find the link to that report and forward it over to you. There might be, and they've done a good job of summarizing the different things that are recommended. I just have a hard time getting myself back to it to read it and figure out how to do some of that. So that might help as well. But yeah, I think that there are some conflicting items out there that are causing some groups to not be able to implement practices quickly. And the last comment I'll leave you with, and I should have unfortunately said it on one of the previous recommendations, is when we've got the environmental justice communities out there saying that they're not getting the same level of resource assistance or that other people that are shovel ready are in a better place and are grabbing up the grant funds. A lot of the communities that I'm talking to, they don't necessarily even know what the best project is that they should be doing out there, let alone if they have a design for it or not. So we don't necessarily want to be supporting them to implement a project if somebody sweeps in and says, hey, you know, the best management practice of this month is green roofs, when they actually need something much more different to help with the problem that they've got there. So we really need to also look at how we get design and engineering going, but before that, the planning to help them prioritize where they need to get their work done first. Not to throw something big at you.
Well, I think that goes a little bit back to my item 10 was guidance and support, and maybe at the planning level to come up with ideas as to where they need to go. And we think that is for those communities that don't know where to start. But
I would agree with that.
Okay. All right, Lauren, any other comments on the flood damage? We've got lots of ideas, and I had to pare it down from 30. So this is where we ended. All right, thanks, everyone. I'll go ahead and pull up Lauren's.
Sorry,
Right, yeah.
I was trying to say something, but I was on mute. So the one thing that I did want to add to that is with addressing sewer backups, I know that there was one item on there where it talks about it from more of an insurance perspective and more of a disclosure for property sales. That being said, is that something that you believe would be worthy of adding as another issue on there? It's been a recurring issue. There's really no regulation of it currently. And pretty much every time that there's heavy rains, I know that we're getting bombarded with phone calls with regards to how to address that. And so I think that from a public perspective and from a homeowner perspective, when you're experiencing something like that, typically those folks are looking for some sort of some sort of regulatory mechanism to address the issue. And so, would that be something that through regulation or legislation that would be something that should be addressed?
If you guys thought my recommendations were too broad before, this was on our list of sewers being undersized, and I think it was so broad we didn't bring it forward because we didn't even know how to approach it. But within our committee, we voted on the items that we felt we could accomplish within the next 5 years. So this is definitely a concern, not just that we're calling it urban flooding during flash flood events that Glenn was talking about. So I'm not exactly sure. We felt like some of our issues, some of our recommendations addressed urban by helping bringing in more experts and doing some of this planning and looking at these databases and determining where the problem areas were. So we felt like we were addressing it inadvertently, but we don't have any recommendations specifically because I think we didn't know how to address it, to be honest. So if anyone in this group has ideas of how we can fix it, please contact me separately. We'd love to include it. We just didn't know it's such a big issue throughout the state.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, well, in the remaining time that we have, hit on integrated water management, which as I mentioned, I feel like the previous 2 hours this morning has been just been a setup for getting into this topic. And before we dive into there, I just want to reflect that, wow, the discussions we're having really is what the State Water Plan Task Force is all about, right? And so I thank you everybody for having these discussions. It's really, I think, the main objective of having the task force is to really get this group of professionals together from the state agencies to really focus and share and debate some of these key topic issues. So I think we're really into the heart of it, and I'm excited where these discussions will take us as a task force going forward. So thank you to everybody for the discussions we've had already on these topics. So integrated water management, really integrated water management is intended to create that mutual empowerment of the people and programs that we are as a state, that we then integrate them together so that their whole is greater than the sum of our parts. That's kind of the philosophical drive, I guess, behind integrated water management, and that water management in the state of Illinois is managed by several agencies, as is reflected by the task force, and so it's the pulling together of those programs into kind of one voice and one focus that becomes part of that integrated water management. And so then in the issues and recommendations, these recommendations are really intended to create the actions to strengthen that communication and collaboration and connection across these existing water-related programs at particularly the state, but it could also expand into federal and local programs as well. So with that, yeah, let's go right into, and I guess Tara, maybe if we just go to the table, and I'll go through. As you mentioned, I had kind of further explanations in my recommendation section, but as we use the table to walk through these, kind of use my narrative to support that. And so number one is really probably in my mind the biggest in this section, and maybe the most important, because it's already been alluded to in all of the topics that we've discussed to date and those yet to come. But it's this idea of establishing and funding. I now call it the Illinois Water Center. Part of our outreach provided significant feedback of Illinois. I don't like Illinois Flood Center as a name. because it focuses too much on one aspect of water. So in this current draft, I'm suggesting the establishment of a Illinois Water Center, and that name could still get refined yet, but that's where we're at today. And that would be, in my mind, created in the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. And it really gets to the heart of, again, that integrated water management to empower and combine the programs that we have in each of our state agencies and programs to be something that's greater than the sum of its parts. But just to kind of hit on some of the key aspects that have already been mentioned, that this water center would be to serve as that portal to a library, right? To be that library of models and of mapping and studies and inundation and new products, really to become that one key location where other agencies or private entities or individuals could go to glean and have that information, or at least get the direction on who has that information, like we mentioned with the private consulting firm generated models, for individual clients, that if you want to do something on, Sugar Creek in this county or something, that you could go there and see if there's existing modeling information at a minimum. And then also, as we've already discussed at some length, this idea that it could become an education center, not only for the water resource professionals, but also for the lay persons and non-for-profits alike, that again touches on each of these topic areas. Could this become our water resource education center, and that we focus on those issues and those technologies and water supply resiliency, as we've talked about first thing this morning, on educating folks on that, and even including educating everyone on social and environmental justice matters. And in my mind, this becomes a center that creates various symposiums on a regular basis to focus on urban flooding or water sustainability, or even recreation for that matter, on how we look at water recreation in the state of Illinois. I see this as we talk about some of the social diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of perspective. I can see where, and to not to pat ourselves on the back, but as an example, we started in some of our outreach to try and have a survey that was bilingual. I can see this becoming more and more of a requirement of state agencies, whether we're talking about public notices or outreach opportunities or pamphlets or flyers, that we need to look at having multilingual kind of documents available. Well, does that mean that EPA has to go hire staff to do that, and DNR or Department of Ag or DOT? Perhaps we together fund a resource center through the Illinois Water Center that has that staffing that can do that for us, and we have a centralized state staffing and resource to help us create those kinds of outreach and state program materials. So that's a purpose that the Illinois Water Center could serve. And then it would be to foster that regular interagency coordination, and that we're doing some of that perhaps through a Silver Jackets efforts, or the lieutenant governor's watershed planning groups that she oversees. But the center could take some leadership on providing that regular interagency collaboration that really expands what we get into in the State Water Plan Taskforce for sharing those program activities and discussing policy perhaps, or we've seen so much cross-cutting issues to really focus on those cross-cutting issues and provide continued interagency collaboration and then to strengthen the relationships in those programs with that. And so to be that convener, and I have experience with the Great Lakes Commission, where the role that commission serves is to be as a convener of 8 states and 2 provinces to, share about Great Lakes issues and concerns. Well, the Illinois Water Center would be, I see it as a convener of those various entities to discuss particular issues and challenges related to water in the state of Illinois. And then to serve as a hub for local assistance as necessary, or as the state agencies might come together to decide we need there. And then finally, the Illinois Water Center could serve as our center for development of research and technologies and tools that we would need for mitigation or water quality or water supply or other water related matters to better empower our state, and as that applies to then federal and local programs. And so, if we're looking right now, DNR and EPA and other agencies are, engaged on this Brandon Road project in Peoria at the Peoria Lock and Dam, and working with the federal government on evaluating technologies for control of invasive species. And we're really getting into some deep science in some cases there. Well, the Illinois Flood Center could serve as our lead, if you will, on those kinds of issues that impact water in the state of Illinois. So it really encompasses a great number of things, but I think in this 5-year focus and in this water plan update, we look to establish and set up funding for that kind of an Illinois Water Center, and really put together as a collection of agencies from the State Water Plan Task Force to develop then a plan to go out and support the implementation of that. And, whether that's educating our elected officials, educating our leadership on what and the benefits that we could each receive through that collaborative effort to get that up and running. So I threw a lot at you on that very first one. I'll stop there and ask for any insights or questions or input. Again, I see this as with the topics yet to cover in this forum for the state water plan. I see this Illinois Water Center really serving all of our needs in some fashion, that we can then use it as a tool and a resource to implement some of these program expansions and things that we want to do there.
Lauren, I'll echo and support all you've just said as far as the activities that are needing to be done or done better, I guess. That a water center could do. And as you know, we've been thinking along those same lines at the water survey. It does strike me a little bit about the name, a water center at the water survey. It's almost like, well, we already have that, right? If you're calling it the water surveyor, actually already does a lot of those things in a sense, although with cutbacks on state funding and so forth, it's become a lot more grant driven, chasing grants. But it's not a criticism. It's just something that stuck out to me as far as the name is concerned. And that's not anything to be too concerned about at this phase, but it does excite me that the work that could be done and the benefits that would give to not just the agencies that are collaborating, but also to the citizens and communities in Illinois.
Yeah, I was kind of laughing when Glenn kind of mentioned that too. Is I think the coordination and collaboration along many of the agencies and that outreach is a great capstone And, again, not a complaint, but I would see, many of the things that are in here are essentially what the water survey was doing 25 years ago. And as Glenn put it, it's just, we've all suffered, state funding cuts and gone more grant driven. To have steadier funding to shore up and leverage, in a better way, grants to help complement something like this is very helpful, because I think straight funding to do it isn't in these days going to work, but I think you need the solid base, and then the grants are out there that can complement things to get something like this done. So I'm very excited about something like this.
Thank you. And we've framed this within PRI. Are we better off just simply coming forward and saying expanding the State Water Survey?
Well, I think there's aspects that maybe, especially if you want to say within some of this five-year plan cycle, that if something, I think there's going to have many of the next 5 years is going to be finding the funding to just get something like this planned and designed, and getting a few aspects started. But I think there's so many more resources within PRI, ecological, geological, that can be added into this, that I think, this could sound self-serving, but I think having it based in the water survey with plans that its arms are going to reach into the rest of PRI is the way it would end up being developed.
And I would like to add one more thought as well, Lauren. And Laura, thank you for that feedback, because it's something I've been thinking about. You're echoing some of my thoughts here. So, but Lauren, it may be a good time to consider having a director level meeting with folks at the water survey or PRI, or even having Director Callahan, yourself, others at OWR, involved with talking to Kevin O'Brien or Jeff Stein, or folks, the leaders at PRI and at the water survey, to sort of begin to coalesce on a compatible vision. So Kevin O'Brien is who I report to. He's the director of the water survey, and I've been more or less the champion so far at the water survey for this idea of a flood center. But I'm feeling his inkling is to move forward in a certain direction with certain priorities and so forth. But I think that I wouldn't want your side of the equation to be decoupled from the water survey or PRI's version of things. Since we're both thinking in the same kind of way, it's probably a good time to consider having a high level meeting to just start setting the tone of what could happen, and getting alignment across at the upper levels of the leadership.
I fully agree, Glenn. I guess I would ask you, particularly if he's your boss, if you could help to collaborate and set that up. To me, we use the draft of a state water plan update as our vehicle, as our tool, to have that meeting and say, well, look, as a collection of state agencies, this is what we've discussed. This is what we're developing as a recommendation in the state water plan, and it definitely impacts and engages the PRI, and so we'd like to initiate that high level discussion, so that it doesn't come out in a completed recommended plan without that without their knowing. So if you could take
Yes.
maybe the lead on trying to put that meeting together, and
Yes.
would certainly welcome any and all of the agencies that would want to participate on that, as well as we then as a task force seek to endorse this recommendation and how that impacts PRI.
Absolutely. Lauren, I'll coordinate more with you, and I'll see what we can start putting together.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Lauren, this is Greg Good. Was this a internally generated recommendation? Was it a public recommendation? And then, I guess, what's your vision for how big this center would have to be to coordinate, collaborate, communicate on all the different things you said under this recommendation? I mean, I was going to talk to Laura a little bit about the idea and the need to have a Illinois Water Monitoring Council that solely got the agencies together just to talk about monitoring and how monumental that in and of itself could be. But an Illinois Water Center, which is very close to Illinois Water Resource Center, which already exists out there, and would this center take the place? Would this be the new state water plan task force, if you will? It just seems like this sounds like a monumental, huge new center that would bring together all of us on all these 13 issues to talk about already. I'm just wondering, is this 10 people to help communication and collaboration between the current agencies and PRI folks, or is it 100 new staff? I'm just curious how big of a vision statement this center is. Thanks.
It is a very large vision there. I'm not sure, it can't get that large overnight. I guess to answer your first question, is it from inside or outside generated? The answer is yes. It's been because of need and because of input from the outside of recognized need, some of which has even come out in our water supply and flood mitigation discussions earlier today. But and I can remember many years ago threatening to need to have like arm wrestle Sally McConkey to see who's got to be the keeper of models in this state, or keeper of mapping, and and so it's been kind of an ongoing discussion, and both sides kind of saying, well, we'd love to, but we don't have the resources, right? And so I guess it's grabbing that concept that we have this need and opportunity to serve the people of Illinois better by the creation of that, and it's time to, I guess, start to put some frame to that, some outline to that, in order to be able to discuss and promote that, to create that. And so obviously it can't start with 100 staff to begin with, but depending on how and what we need this to be, are we being better state government by trying to centralize some of these services, because we as agencies are all facing the same challenge of being able to get staffing on board. But can we bring staffing on as a state that serves our programs in a centralized manner? And I guess that's even a bigger discussion on how to run state government. But to me, it prompts some of those discussions and questions, because we really are talking about shared resources here.
Greg, if I can answer some of your question, because you and I were talking about a monitoring council type of thing. I think in the bigger scheme, in the 1984 state water plan, the state water plan task force was designated to be meeting on a quarterly basis to do just what we're talking about here, is to making sure all agencies and entities are talking on a regular basis and sharing information, programmatic needs, collaboration, things of that nature. And I would still like to see a more invigorated state water plan task force that that a water center um, is responsible to on a certain level, so that the needs are being met through this type of collaboration. And then I would also see, that things are so big that I think they do need to be busted up a little bit. But Greg, in the effort of the of a water monitoring, water quality monitoring type of focus group, is again something that might be another spoke on the wheel that runs around the task force, of which then is then connected, obviously, into a water center type of focus, and collaboration on that level. Because I think if we want to meet needs of the state and local government and citizens, I really think the task force needs to be the linchpin and probably be funded to have its own little executive committee so that it can stay operational and keep everybody together. And then the water center and any other center like a water quality monitoring center um, are funded with a little more focus, so things don't get too unwieldy. But I would like to recommend some structure of that sort, so you can actually address it in better chunks.
Yeah, thank you. In my mind, I did not see it becoming the task force. I saw the task force still remaining as a key entity, and the water center, like Laura said, serving the task force. It becomes our library as a base.
So maybe including maybe in that establishing of the center how it is part or an arm of the task force or something like that. I don't know. Greg, did any of that kind of give you ideas of how a water quality monitoring?
Yeah, I guess and I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, but water is such a big topic.
Yeah.
And to have, it sounds like this water center really needs to have a specific focus. I mean, there's so much to water. And to have a singular water center that then the public might go to, would the water center say, well, you just have to go talk to EPA and Chris Davis to get a 319 grant if you're really there to help a local community, or to Gary Bingenheimer to get a grant for or loan to do this, that, or the other. We all have responsibilities and laws and legislations that we have to live with, and to put all of that with all of our different agencies and talking about at least 13 different issues, all of that under one roof in a water center, that's a big thing. So I'll just leave it at that. And
yeah, in my mind, I don't see it being programs as more as resourcing those programs. Again, a repository, a multilingual staffing or something. I see it as being servant to the programs that are out there. Again, and we can continue to vet and refine the concept as we go forward. I think some of what you were talking about, Greg, I get to in my my number 3 recommendation.
okay, yeah, and I'm sorry, this is kind of the first time I've heard about it. We just got I didn't get a chance to look at all this, so appreciate the time there. So yeah, we should just keep moving, I guess.
Yeah, and no, and this is exactly why we're doing this, right? Is to get that insights and your perspectives from your program and agency. And so if for everyone, even after we're done this morning, as thoughts come to mind, or if you've, this is rattled around in your brain over lunch and something comes, please, shoot thoughts and other comments to the topic leads. And that's what we're doing here is at the end, this is our collective product. And so we need to all be bought into it. And so it needs to reflect your thoughts and insights as well. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to number 2. Again, understanding of welcoming comments on all of these. The integrated programs for capital improvements, and this kind of just plays off of some of what we've already been talking about, and we talked about in water supply, was this idea that DNR, we have a good database or an understanding of, for example, water loss through annual reporting that comes to our agency for Lake Michigan water allocation, and we know kind of even within a community where particular bad spots are within their system, particularly in disadvantaged communities, and yet we are, sister agency EPA manages the revolving fund or the checkbook there that can resource some of those improvements. And so the idea of coming together to create a program that helps identify priorities, particularly for those disadvantaged communities, to bring those forward. And I say all that to tell the group that this is already in the works. The DNR and EPA are already meeting to discuss this kind of collaboration and going forward. So this was just more including it in the plan because it's something that's already in the works and fits in within this particular focus. Any comments or questions there?
In the funding column, I guess I would change that to a no. We don't currently get any state funding for the revolving fund programs. We occasionally might get some money to match our federal grant, but that's pretty rare, and it's not needed. We like it when it happens, but it's not needed. And then it wouldn't require legislation, but it would require a change to our existing administrative rules just to change the prioritization scoring process for our applications.
I find that, so it's interesting that you say we would not want to advocate for more state funding for that the federal funding coming in is sufficient for what we're trying to accomplish there, or?
We could ask for our annual federal grant state match to be provided. And then if we were to get that money, maybe that could be part of another funding document that Chris Davis and I are working on, that if that funding were to be provided by the state, we could certainly find uses for other revolving fund monies that may be freed up to do other things. But we don't typically get money from the state currently.
Let me kind of jump ahead here a little bit. I get into it in recommendation 4, but what if private dollars were available?
To do what?
Infrastructure improvements, water supply, or wastewater. I mean, if there were foundations or those kinds of funds.
I would take as much as I could get.
Yeah, I mean,
do we need to provide a way to make that happen if the private side or philanthropic side wanted to help?
Yeah, I think we'd have to figure out a way to promote it, or I mean, it's always possible for that to be part of the funding picture.
And again, that might be where a pilot program could be of benefit to us because, again, offering something that probably 80% of the state wants to tap into before we even have something created would probably make more work than it would benefit.
Right.
Yeah, that may be better addressed under our funding document because it's often promoted out there, these P3 partnerships, but putting them into practices proves to be difficult if there's not a vehicle to facilitate it.
Well, maybe any other comments on number 2? I might jump to number 4 since we're kind of headed on that path, springing off of this one. Any other comments on number 2? And Greg and Chris, I may follow up with you, separately, just as we refine some of that. So then, jumping to number 4, because we've been talking about, this idea of, well, what if private dollars came in for, promoting, water supply infrastructure or wastewater infrastructure, or in this case, I have it identified as multi-benefit floodplain planning and use. Some of that springs from, American Rivers and the Illinois Environmental Council. They are working on developing this kind of a plan and fully intend to lobby and push hard for a P3 relationship or a P3 kind of set up to be established. And so knowing that, I guess what number 4 is suggesting is, because they talked about, well, and if we do a P3 plan within their plan that they're preparing, wanting to reach out to all these state programs. Well, as I read through their kind of proposal, that was us. That was the State Water Plan Task Force that represented all of those entities that they wanted to be sure were included in a P3 relationship for multi floodplain planning, and maybe that could be multi benefit water resource planning for that matter. But that this recommendation is basically saying, look, if and when those kinds of partnerships come into discussion, consider the state water plan as that point on that kind of collaboration. So that's what this recommendation is basically saying. So in essence, it adds work to our existence, potentially. But it becomes that focused, we are that focused group of agencies with the water perspective. And so this is recommending that we be recognized as such in discussions related to those kinds of partnerships should they form. So I'm not within this recommendation, I'm not advocating that a P3 be formed, but suggesting that as P3s are considered, that the State Water Task Force be that center of the hub, that point for the state on those as those P3s that would be considered related to water issues.
You have there that we're going to need additional funding for personnel You know, which agency is that going to fall under, and are those the people that are envisioned to do this planning efforts to produce these asset management plans or whatever you want to call them?
Well, in number 4, the way it's worded right now, it's to promote multi-benefit floodplain planning, and so that's where I just have the State Water Plan Task Force identified right there, but yeah, if it's floodplain planning, it would probably be more of a DNR. If it's watershed planning, maybe an EPA. If it's water supply planning or water resource from infrastructure, it could be about any of the agencies. So I might add in multi-benefit floodplain and water resource planning and use. I might add in water resource.
Yeah, what I would recommend that we don't limit this just to floodplain is there can probably be a lot of other assets to this.
Yeah. So I don't know that there's any issues. It is just identifying the task force. I guess we'd have to see as that was developed what we might need to advocate for. It's in there because we've seen the train coming down the tracks, I guess, and wanted to acknowledge that in the state water plan. Jumping back to number 3 then, that we skipped over, and we've already chatted about this to some extent. This was, again, reestablishing, kind of like Laura was saying, well, gosh, we 25 years ago, we did all that stuff in the state water survey, that we talked about for the water center. Well, same here of this, a lot of the outreach and collaboration with communities to help educate and kind of hold their hand on some of these aspects of even knowing what programs are even out there or available to communities, or knowing how to even go about accessing assistance, comes back into this kind of reestablishing staffing and funding a local assistance program within the DNR, Office of Water Resources. We did do this to a large extent, again, a number of years ago, and just because of staff or head cut counts and budget issues and so on and so forth, that got, and with retirements and so on, kind of just worked its way out of our existing team within DNR. And so it was this idea of establishing a section that would visit communities and be that point for communities that would go out there. And right now, for example, under our National Flood Insurance Program coordination, we have to audit those communities or visit all those communities that are in the National Flood Insurance Program. But when we go there, we have definitely a narrowed focus on just floodplain, National Flood Insurance Program ordinance enforcement and management of the floodplains locally to enforce or live up to that local ordinance. But in fact, that community might say, well, we've got a flood problem over here on 7th Street, or we've got a real problem with our water supply or our wastewater with this or that. They'd be like, well, sorry, we're only here for National Flood Insurance Program purposes. But in fact, this would envision that kind of a state resource person being there to know those communities and hear their concerns, and being able to say, well, hey, I should get you in touch with Chris at IEPA, or I can get you in touch with the Department of Ag for this or that program that would just again be that point and that resource to help those communities, particularly the disadvantaged communities, to bring in the social justice side of things, to be able to help them know how to best use and utilize state programs.
Lauren, this is Greg Good. I guess that number 3 kind of brings me to the point that I was trying to get at before with the Illinois Water Center. Your number 3 and your number 1F really is saying the same thing. So if I were a community, do I go to this Illinois Water Center, or do I come to DNR for that local assistance? So I guess with the Illinois Water Center, it's just got to be very clear and concise what the goal of that center is, because it seems like these things kind of cross-cut a little bit. You could have those, Tara wants that program, have a team out there, which is great, and within DNR, but then this Illinois Water Center also serves that very same purpose, at least on paper right now.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. No, that's good. Thank you.
I had F circled on the text there as well, because I saw that same parallel there. To me, I think number 3 here is that staffing. Maybe F could be more refined to be kind of the resources, or are they? Is the water center providing the handout materials or website materials that this staff person could point to, that shares some of that. So it wouldn't necessarily, if this is a section within DNR that we're not, besides trying to do outreach across the state to all these communities, that we're not also trying to develop the flyers and so forth that talk about all potential funding for say water supply infrastructure improvements, or green infrastructure, stormwater management. That's where I saw the water center serving as a hub for the development of those materials, I guess, or those resources that support this section of outreach. And so maybe I could work to clarify that more on the flood center. Does that help?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Other comments or insights on number 3? All right, then moving to the final ones here, number 5 and 6. And I do have them asterisked, I think, in the text, only because these are recommendations that were made in the Urban Flood Awareness Report as well, and so they're just being reiterated here because they fit. And that was this idea of number 5, developing consistent program funding criteria across state agencies. And so this kind of comes into that, well, I want to do this, this action in the floodplain or something. Well, if you go to Water Resources and you're going to want to build something, well, you're going to have to do a full economic analysis and show a BC ratio. But if you go to this other program, maybe through DCEO, well, you can have a large pot of money with really no strings attached to it to do that. And so it was having some consistency in how we determine how state dollars are doled out, and understanding that there may be existing legislative authorities that still mandate some of that, but at least drawing attention to the idea that these discrepancies exist. And so as a goal of the task force, I guess, would be to develop this program funding criteria, or to look at that over the next 5 years. So that's not saying make it all equal. It's saying we need to evaluate and look to develop some consistency to our funding criteria. And that might have some ties and cross-cutting back into more of the criteria that we mentioned, establishing for serving disadvantaged or prioritizing disadvantaged communities. And so maybe that's becomes a what part of this is, right? That are we all what are we calling a disadvantaged community? Are we all singing from the same sheet of music on what is or is not a disadvantaged community that would potentially get special dispensation for state funding? And then number 6, this was also a recommendation out of that report, but this is the Illinois Mitigation Advisory Group. And so, and IEMA would need to serve really as the point there, because this is when disasters happen and federal funds become available to the state of Illinois for mitigation actions. Ta-da, here's a sack of money. How are you going to best manage that? This is really a reinvigoration of this IMAG committee that has the perspectives from all agencies, really similar to the State Water Plan Task Force, that says, well, hey, if we've got fresh money coming into our state, have we considered this perspective as we look to what mitigation activities should be used? Typically, from my involvement in some of this, they come in, you get requests for consideration, and everybody wants generators across the board, right? Give us a nice Caterpillar generator that we can use to keep power to this, that, and the other. And oftentimes you get a large number of requests coming in for safe rooms in a community that happen to have a nice wooden floor and a couple of basketball hoops on each end and some locker rooms, and lo and behold, it looks like a brand new gymnasium to me, but it's a safe room. So those kinds of things are vetted, but this was just, that group had kind of narrowed down to a very small group, and so this recommendation is saying, in the spirit of our collaborated better communication amongst our state agencies related to those efforts, that it ought to have the opportunity to include these additional perspectives on how that money is spent. Any questions or comments there? Okay, well, in the interest of time, it is 12:20. Thank you, everybody, for the participation today. Again, as I mentioned, if some of these items that we've talked about this morning continue to rattle around in your brain, or you have some other discussions with other folks in your agency, and things come to mind, this process doesn't need to end here this morning, but can continue to reach out to the topic leads with additional insights and thoughts on the matter. So with that, I'll turn it back to Wes or Tara to take us through the remainder of the agenda for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I think I see that we're kind of running a little bit later than what we'd like, so I'll just kind of go over briefly the idea of the next meeting will be October 7th. There was some question of whether or not that was the best date. Does anyone have issue with the October 7th date?
Yeah, Wes, this is Greg Good. I'm sure that we'll probably have to discuss the water quality draft that we'll have done before then. I'm on a flight to Salt Lake City to see a grandchild, 2 sons and 2 daughter-in-laws. So didn't know if there was room to move that just back one day, if it's too late in the game to do that, to October 6th or even a day or two before that. So I could be around for that meeting, but if not, then Mike or somebody else can give that presentation. Unless some of the presentations might even be available yet to be given in November. I don't know how.
Yeah, Greg, and that's kind of where I was going. Well, I think, I guess I'll throw out the group. Are the meetings running a little long to cover 3 topics? Would we prefer to only cover 2 topics and maybe push out our schedule a little bit later? I just wanted to see feedback on how everybody was feeling. I know we're starting an hour earlier and we're typically running a little later. Last time we only covered 2 topics. This time we kind of cut in and tried to squeeze in 3. Just any thoughts or opinions on formatting and whether or not we should try and cut back in 2 and maybe pull the meeting size back to a 2.5 hours, somewhere in there.
I vote for 2 topics. It's still the same amount of time, so we have, a good chance to really thoroughly talk things through.
Yeah, I
And
think
just to
sometimes
remind
we'll
you,
have.
Sorry, Wes, we do have 8 topics left to discuss. So if we did 2 per meeting, we might have to have 2 meetings per month just to keep the project within the parameters.
Any other thoughts on meeting formats, whether we extend the schedule out later, we just keep the meetings long?
I would rather do 3 and do 3 more meetings. And then that would be 3 more meetings, 2 with 3 and 1 with 2, and keep them the 3 hours.
Well, and note right now we're on 3.5 hours, and that doesn't allow us to have any follow-up discussion on things that came up, such as, formatting as we kind of run into it, funding. We had a couple of questions on things like that. So we're running to be almost a 4-hour meeting at this point. I guess is there's any concern with just pushing out later as well as another option of extending the schedule out later?
Well, we're not mandated, right, to meet any particular date. And I'm finding that I think these, as I mentioned earlier, these discussions are incredibly valuable, and I think it really gets to the heart of what the State Water Plan Task Force is and is intended to be. So certainly okay, pushing the schedule further if necessary, if we continue to have great collaboration on these issues.
Yeah, Lauren, my only concern is with doing 3 topics, if the participants start wearing down a little bit by the time we start running 3 hours plus.
Understood. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm okay to extend if we need to.
But what if we did 2 topics, but maybe every 3 weeks, and then we only extend a little bit rather than a whole lot?
That was going to be my recommendation too, Laura.
This is Mike, and I'll say, a lot of my difficulty getting to these has been because of the length of the meeting and being able to shoehorn that in with all the other meetings. So longer meetings aren't necessarily easier.
I would concur with that. This is Michael from Department of Ag. It's just hard to get in and out with a lot of different meetings going on. So shorter more often would be fine with me.
So I'm hearing 2 topics every 3 weeks. Or are you thinking soon, more frequent, or is 3 weeks good?
Let's go with 3 weeks.
It probably depend on how it lands, because obviously we got holidays coming up in November and December, so I don't know if we want to be so rigid in a certain number of weeks as actually just trying to fit some things in.
Yeah, I think we can kind of look at the calendar, but just kind of have a ballpark idea trying to move forward, and maybe pre-scheduling some of these as much as possible so we can get them on everyone's calendar as early as possible. With that, I show 3 weeks as being October 29th. I'm sorry, September 29th. Is that look feasible for everybody?
This is Greg Good. I have a meeting. Actually, it's a Upper Mississippi River Basin Association Water Quality Task Force meeting in Dubuque. If it doesn't get turned down, just to a telephone call. But again, if the water quality issue isn't necessarily going to be discussed on that date, I don't want to thwart the majority. So.
Likewise, this is Michael Woods. I have something for that whole week of training. I don't know if we could look to October 4th on Monday, or again, if we're not discussing something that the Department of Ag is associated with, I could yield to, whatever the schedule is.
The other thing I can do is, chances are, I don't think all 20 participants that we had on here will likely be able to meet all meetings. I could send out essentially an availability poll to see when works best for everybody, if that's probably the best method. The other thing we will need is volunteers for who will be presenting their topics at the next meeting.
Yeah, I like the idea of the availability poll to help give us some guidance, and we can draft some suggested schedule of meeting dates, and then that would maybe help folks decide when they could present their topic.
Okay, well, I will. Go on ahead.
This is Greg Good. If I could indulge the group and have the water quality issue talked about in November, I'd appreciate that, since we're got a little late on this. But don't do it after the 24th, because I'm retired. But I'll be back for a 75-day, and this is one of my topics of work that I'll be working on. So.
Okay, well, I will send out availability for the next meeting. I might do a follow-up availability for the meeting following that, just to try and get everybody's schedules worked out as early as possible. And once we get the date set, then I will try and confirm who is available on that date to share their topics. Does that sound good with everyone?
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll update the schedule on the State Water Plan Task Force website. I'd go over it, but it's already out of date based on our last 5-minute conversation. So I don't know if we need to go over that, but it's probably looking that we'll be heading into a spring, maybe even a late spring, early summer for publication, given the schedule push out and everything. We'll get that revised and send that out to the group. Lauren, that's all I had, unless you have anything you want to say as a wrap up.
Nope, just awesome discussions today. Appreciate everyone's participation, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.